In our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, he has taken us to a deeper understanding of this idea of a deeper sense behind our sense, which is a perception existing in a consciousness down, an essentially divine and supra-mental consciousness. And now he takes us deeper into this understanding by pointing out that the Kena Upanishad is not just speaking of a deeper sense which makes possible our perception. It points to a deeper distinction among senses existing in that consciousness. That there is a seeing behind our seeing and a hearing behind our hearing. And so Sri Aurobindo now prepares us to recognize where that distinction comes. In a consciousness of unity, there is not just one flat sense. There is still the experience of multiple senses. What is it in that consciousness that makes for multiple senses? And that's the theme of this chapter, which Sri Aurobindo begins by showing us that in the Indian psychology, mind was called the 11th of the senses. 5 organs of knowledge, 5 of action, and it is this 6th mind which is both organ of knowledge, organ of action. And it is when mind pays attention that we say we see or we hear. And therefore it seems all senses appear to be only organizations, functionings, instrumentations of the mind consciousness, devices which it has formed in the course of its evolution in living matter. So we can see how in a single cell consciousness, although mind is not so overt, but still the consciousness within, reaching out to gaze, to sense its world outside, of perception by organizing specialized organs through which it is able to direct itself. Into those specialized organs, it develops specialized functionings. We see not merely one flat black and white image, we also distinguish colors. When we hear, it is not just an overall imprint of volume, but the ability to distinguish finer sounds, instruments, nuances. And in the eyes, there are various functions which allow us to control the quantum of light that comes in, to control the focus of the thing where we put our attention. It's not just one organ that is fixed. The organ itself has multiple functions. And then within that, finer instrumentations for the mind consciousness. In the case of the eye, for example, we are able to focus all our attention on a single spot. Although the eye is taking in information all around at the same time, we are able to somehow disengage one part from the rest. We are able to in the functioning of the distinctions by which we can separate as if one object from its background and identify it separately, entirely ignoring what is happening in the background. And this object is as if a cutout from the background, and yet there is this ability to be able to separate out. And all of these are things which have been developed over a long process of evolution. And so beginning with the single cell and its ability to sense, as the organisms have evolved and become more sophisticated, the means of perception also have been formed in the course of the evolution of mind, concerning matter. We have so far 5 senses, 5 and 5, 10 for the sense of knowledge and of action. Recall last time we discussed the suggestion that there are 7 and 7, that we will be taking up later on. For the moment, I will set it aside. It will be more interesting to discuss it when we understand why there are 5, which will be later in this chapter. Sri Aurobindo, now having brought us to the focus of mind, mind being this 11th sense, which looks through all this, which organizes all this, we need to understand mind more deeply. And so the next few paragraphs take us to that. Modern psychology has extended our knowledge and led us to a truth which the ancients already knew, but expressed in other language. In the most of modern discoveries, whether in psychology or even science, we find, if we look deeply enough, they have not only been anticipated, they have been discussed often quite extensively by the ancients. But they used a vocabulary, even sometimes a symbolism, which makes it so different that it's difficult to make a one-to-one correspondence. And there is a reason for that. Modern science approaches these explorations from a certain innate bias. As a result, whatever it is seeing, it is translating in terms of its bias. The ancients saw the same thing without this limitation, saw more deeply, saw the deeper root of things, and therefore the same functioning they articulated in terms of that root, which makes for a very different perspective, even a very different vocabulary. Understanding the working of the mind, the bias of modern science was simply that mind emerges out of matter, out of functioning of the brain and nervous system. The moment you have taken this position, automatically mind is limited by the biology. Because the biology is finite, mind must therefore be finite. When we discover that mind is actually capable of so much more than the biology supports, then we look more deeply in the biology to see where the memory could be stored. And so if you notice the way any of the brain has developed, in the 1970s, because it was a time when they were just going to the moon, so that was very much in the consciousness, they said, we have just now begun to understand the complexity of the brain. And if we had to recreate the brain with modern technology in the 70s, then it would be as big as the moon. So it was an example of the miniaturization of the biology. But subsequently, every 2 years, our technology has become finer, double in capacity, in speed, in memory, etc. So going from the 70s to today, not only technology has increased, improved, and become much more fine, but our understanding of the brain has grown so much. We've come to now the acceptance that unlike our earlier idea that the brain stores by making changes in molecules and rearranging molecules, we're beginning to think that perhaps the brain is storing memory at a quantum level. Now the quantum is like an escape route. The moment you say quantum, any weird thing is acceptable there because the quantum world is weird. So somehow at a quantum level, which means we don't know how exactly, it's happening at a level which is smaller than an escape route. We do not explain how. And with that new understanding of the brain, we say today, if we had to make a computer which is as sophisticated as the brain, it would be as big as the moon with all the modern technology. All of which goes to show that we are beginning to recognize the real scope of the mind, but still with the error of trying to reduce it to the brain. In the latest statement, which I saw 2 months ago, the scientists, having measured now the level at which memories are stored, they came to the conclusion that this little brain here inside the head can store all the information that exists in the entire internet and still more. Now that is a humongous amount. It goes into so many thousands of petabytes. Petabytes is one followed by, what is it, 12, 15 or 18 zeros of bits of information, 18 or 15, something like that. It is such a huge number that if we had to make computers of that size, we would not be able to manage it easily, and then to power it. But it's just a recognition that in the mind, the capacity is actually so much larger and larger. Each time we look more deeply, we find it's larger. So the suggestion, if you go deep enough with your intuition, is actually it is infinite. But this is what the ancients already knew, but they expressed in another language. And I will just read what Sri Aurobindo has to say, and then we'll come back to this example. We know now, or we rediscover the truth, that the conscious operation of mind is only a surface action. There is a much vaster and more potent subconscious mind which loses nothing of what the senses bring to it. It keeps all in an inexhaustible store of memory. Akshitam Shravaha. Now, Sri Aurobindo is making correspondence to the ancient knowledge and the modern knowledge. So rather than quoting extensively from the ancient, he just throws you one keyword from the Veda, and that's the link point of what the Veda had to say. Akshitam Shrava. Shrava is hearing. Akshitam. Ksha is the root meaning reducing, losing, limiting, ending. Akshitam meaning not having an end, not having a reduction, not having a limitation, unending therefore, without constraint. Hearing, which is as if unending. So there's a suggestion in the Vedic usage of the term which has a dual side. We'll just return to that. But first he is pointing to it as a vaster, more powerful subconscious mind which loses nothing of what the senses bring to it. Everything coming in all the time at every moment is being somehow stored and retained in that level, which is subconscious. It is vaster and also more powerful. Vast because it can hold more knowledge. More powerful because it can do more with that knowledge than our conscious mind can. For example, there are people, as you know, geniuses, who are able to do massive calculations without pausing for a moment. You write a 10-digit number multiplied by another 10-digit number, they look at it and then write the answer forward to back. Now, if you actually do the calculation, there is a carryover, so you have to go back to forward if you want to write it through a calculation process. But when you know the number directly, you can write forward to back. And that's what they're doing. They look at this, they know the answer, and they write. Or other examples of geniuses who are able to recite pi, the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, which is one of those special numbers they call transcendental numbers because it is in its sequence. You can never represent it with a finite representation. You can never reduce it to a finite formula. The number is inherently infinite in its ability to be represented. And so you can keep on reciting the series 3.141569, etc. And there are people who can go on reciting 400, 500, 1,000, 10,000, a million digits just like that. How do they know? They're not memorizing it. They can just go in a stream. And all of these are abilities which are natural to that subconscious level of our mind. And there is a narrow frontal operation which we call conscious mind. I am conscious, I am thinking, I am struggling, I am learning to multiply a 2-digit number with a 2-digit number. But that can already do this and so much more, and we're not even conscious of it. It is watching, though, everything. And while I'm reading my novel and I'm completely immersed in it, that has heard all the sounds of the traffic. That has heard people having a conversation and retained the meaning of the conversation which I'm not conscious of, even of having heard. And where necessary, it can pop up that knowledge also. Under hypnosis, so much can be accessed, and he will make reference to that. Loses nothing of what the senses bring to it. It keeps all its wealth in an inexhaustible store of memory. So this is wealth, all that's coming in, and it treasures it. And the store itself is inexhaustible. You can keep on filling in, and it never ends. Akshitam Shravaha. So without limitation hearing, is what we would translate literally of this term. But the suggestion in the use is not only it can store unendingly, but it can listen without limitation. It can extend listening to a great distance without limitation. So this deeper hearing of the subconscious registration not only is taking in through the physical senses, but has access through subtle senses to all accessible sensory experience in the universe. And Sri Aurobindo will point to this later. Now, Sri Aurobindo gives us several examples. Three in particular. The surface mind may pay no attention, still the subconscious mind attends, receives, treasures up with an infallible accuracy. So even though I am distracted, all that is being registered in the subconscious. But it does three things. Attends. Now the conscious mind is not paying attention, but the conscious is paying attention. It is listening, it is reaching out. What's happening out there? It is active. Attending, receiving, and then treasuring up with an infallible accuracy. It actually cannot make an error. And this is something extraordinary. The conscious mind in remembering can make an error that subconscious cannot. In his writings on education, Sri Aurobindo refers to these two functions of memory. He says there is this automatic memory, which is already perfect. You have to do nothing. And then there is the conscious mind and its conscious memory. That is what needs to be trained. And if somehow you could bridge the two, imagine you can have access to all memories of all things down to the time you were born and before you were born. And everything in same vivid, rich detail as if you're experiencing it right now. All that can be drawn out. In fact, this is what happens under certain conditions during experiments when they trigger parts of the brain, electrically or otherwise. And certain parts which correspond to the subconscious, particularly the back, when you trigger it, suddenly memories come vividly of childhood which you had completely forgotten, and you had forgotten that you had forgotten. That's the depth of memory. And suddenly you remember and you relive it vividly. All the smells, colors, tastes, richly felt as if it's happening right now. Except you know it's not happening through these senses. It's coming in from the memory, and it's something recalled, but with full intensive vividness. Now he gives three examples. The illiterate servant girl hears daily her master reciting Hebrew in his study. The surface mind pays no attention to the unintelligible gibberish. But the subconscious mind hears, remembers, and when in an abnormal condition it comes up to the surface, reproduces those learned recitations with a portentous accuracy, which the most correct and retentive scholar might envy. Now he's taking this example. In fact, at that time when Sri Aurobindo wrote this, it was 100 years ago, it was one of the examples which had come into prominence in the media of a case where there was a servant girl who was doing a study of a Hebrew scholar. He was reciting his sacred texts. The girl used to sweep and her mind would be wandering, thinking other things. She was uneducated. Of course, she did not know Hebrew at all, and she was not even interested. She was just doing her work. And then one day she fell ill, and it was a very severe illness. She was in high fever. At that point, the conscious mind has been numbed by the intensity of the fever, The subconscious mind is fully exposed. At state fever, she began to recite those very verses which the subconscious had registered the master reading. And with perfect accuracy, intonation, rhythm, exactly like him, with the same accent and pronunciation. Later, when she recovered from the fever, she had no memory of it. She could not recollect. She could not repeat. And so, this is one remarkable example. It shows you that that memory has nothing to do with the conscious intention or your education. The second example. Not heard because he did not attend, because he did not pay attention, put attention on that to register. The greater man or mind within has heard because he always attends. Now he's using a vocabulary here very precisely. Greater man or mind, suggesting that not only there is a greater mind behind, but there's also a greater personality behind, of which it has this mind, of which it has also other aspects which relate to personality and individuality, sense of purpose, that personality is not merely a memory recalling and registering, but is conscious and with an intention watches. Perhaps it does not interfere most of the time, but if with that higher superior perception and consciousness, it senses danger, it can rapidly project itself forward, intervene, seize on the danger. And this is the example Sri Aurobindo has recorded from his own life in one of his sonnets, where he was on the horse carriage and there was a momentary danger of an accident, and this giant personality behind rose out of himself, took charge of the situation, seized upon it, seized the reins of the horses and averted the accident. But he was conscious that this personality came forward in something, the surface part is in a shock. We're not even conscious that there was an intervention. And so much more often, the intervention comes to avoid the accident in a way that we do not even know that there was a danger of accident. I'm digressing, but just as an example, I remember once I was in Delhi with some friends, and they had got me to meet a saint at that time who passed away, Baba Nagpal, who's responsible for building many temples. There were many miracles associated with him and his life. He was a remarkable man. I did have occasion to meet him once. And he spoke to me of certain things which were almost like when he knew I was from the Sri Aurobindo ashram, he spoke of things which actually unfolded later. They were there in seed form, but events happened. And he spoke of very simple. He said, you know, there's a tree, so one has to prune branches to keep the tree healthy. And he was speaking at a level which I could register separately from the words. It was quite a remarkable experience. And I came back. Then we were discussing, and my friend said, another time someone had gone, one of his businessman friends, and this Baba kept him sitting. And the man said, I have to go now. And he kept said, wait. And about 2 hours passed. Finally, the man got a little restless. And then that Baba told him, I'm asking you to wait because I'm trying to avert an accident. And after a while, 2 hours later, he said, now you can go. It's fine. You're free of it. It was interesting to see how a person who's conscious can sense the flow, let's say, trend of forces. It can also intervene, avoid, in a way that you would never even know. If he had not mentioned it, you would never know what was being done. And there was a longer part to the story, and subsequently things took a different turn in my own case. And that was a suggestion. I had an accident on the way back, and I linked it to certain discussions we had. But it was as if something was warning through those circumstances. So there is a part within us that senses, that knows, and occasionally something of it reflects in the surface mind, and even more rarely, it can come forward as a personality, take charge, and, 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 difficulties. So Just a suggestion thrown, and you see how much he is pointing to. The man or mind on the surface has not heard. The greater man or mind within has heard, because he always attends, or rather subtends. It's a very rarely used word. Subtends, below stretching, is the literal sense of the word. That is, below the conscious awareness, it is stretching, extending itself and working. Subtends with an infinite capacity. He's seeing it, the capacity is infinite, the actual memory capacity is infinite, even the power of knowledge is infinite. So too, a man put under an anesthetic and operated upon has felt nothing. But release his subconscious mind by hypnosis, and he will relate accurately every detail of the operation and its appropriate sufferings. For the stupor of the physical sense organ could not prevent the larger mind within from observing and feeling. Now, this example is even more important. The first example, at least the girl was conscious in her sensory apparatus. Her mind was elsewhere, but the ears were working, the eyes were working. But here is a situation where you've put a person under anesthetic and there's a surgery taking place. Now, not only the mind is asleep, this mind, this is also supposed to operating. In that part, let's say on the arm, if the surgery is happening, the whole thing has been made numb. So the nerves are not transmitting signals. So while the surgery is taking place, there is no sensation of pain. So ostensibly, the actual physical apparatus of sensation is not functional. And yet, he says, the larger mind within is observing and feeling, because under hypnosis, when you have released the subconscious mind, it can relate accurately every detail of the operation and its appropriate sufferings. Meaning what the body felt at cutting, suffered, it's all registered there in that consciousness. Although in the biology of the body, there is no machinery to have sent that information through. So this example takes us even deeper to show the power of this subconscious mind. Now this works very extensively in further explorations. When we use the word modern, Sri Aurobindo is speaking of modern psychology 100 years ago. Well, modern psychology today has gone even farther with actual experiments to see how far this capacity exists, how far it can be tapped to assist and to influence. So there were a series of experiments which I have read of, where people under general anesthesia during surgery were told certain things by the doctor, and it was a part of the experiment. In cases where the surgery was very simple, the doctor expected no complication. He was asked to say the opposite. Oh, this is a very difficult case. It looks like there will be many complications. It will take a long time for the healing. Just a statement like that. And the result was, in those cases, there was actually complication and delay in healing. Other cases which were very complex and the doctor was worried of complications, he was asked to say the opposite. Oh, this is no problem, the patient will heal quickly, within 2 days he'll be up and everything will be fine. And in fact, that tended to happen. And this is statistically very significant, the numbers. What is being shown here is the suggestion put at a subconscious level in the subconscious mind is actually healing the biology, influence the biological healing process. At the level of the cells, the healing process is being influenced by what you were told when you were unconscious completely. And supposedly even your hearing was not operative. And even a statement casually made. In fact, if you go to surgeries and you are present during a long surgery, you will find doctors chatting, talking about cinema, talking about the current problems in politics, talking about some recent terrorist attack, without concern for the patient who's under general anesthetic. The mood is so flippant, so casual. And often they're making crude jokes with each other, talking about the patient in a crude way, or did you notice the way this part of the body looks, and things like that. And all of that has an influence, and in fact is registered at a subconscious level by the patient, affecting everything. And remember here, he notes accurately details of the operation and its sufferings. Of course, the conversations also. But if the suffering of the biology is being registered and the conversation also, imagine those flippant comments about the patient will actually affect you on a certain level. And these things, of course, act within us when spoken consciously, but they are much more effective when spoken at a subconscious level. Because when you speak consciously, the conscious mind is there as a filter. When you tell me that I am not good enough, I say, well, is there an interest? Are you trying to confuse me? Are you angry with me? What is your interest? And there's a filter. But when I'm subconscious and the doctor says, oh, this fellow, he is not good at all, I don't have that filter. And the whole thing is accepted by the subconscious like a post-hypnotic suggestion and affect biological healing at a cellular level. And so the examples Sri Aurobindo is giving, they go straight to the heart, and now we have so much more to back up these facts. Similarly, we're coming to the third example, we know that a large part of our physical action is instinctive and directed not by the surface but by the subconscious mind. So the first two examples had to do with the organs of knowledge. This example has to do with the organs of 5 senses for knowledge, 5 for action. So he is completing the full spectrum. In our action also, he says, there's a large part of our physical action, not just the mind, a large part which is instinctive and directed not by the surface but by the subconscious mind. Simple example, breathing. We're not conscious of it at all. It's happening all the time. Heartbeat. The control of the blood pressure is happening automatically, which when we begin to observe, we are astounded. Initially, they thought it's just the heart which pumps and controls the blood pressure. No. They discover eventually that the arteries through which the blood passes, they compress or expand to balance out the blood pressure all over the body. And when the arteries become less flexible, then the blood pressure overall rises because the heart alone is not able to balance it out. If it was true that only the heart controlled blood pressure, it would have to push so hard that the pressure would be very high here and would become weaker and weaker as it went into finer and finer capillaries. And particularly pressure there, the pressure in the chest would have to be so high that it would burst a vessel. The reality is the heart pushes, and then the arteries actually act in a pulsation manner to push blood forward. As long as they are flexible, they also assist in pushing, which maintains the pressure in the fine capillaries. And the whole body is literally moving in a pulsating rhythm, subtle, but distinct and critical to the overall balance of the blood pressure in the system. What maintains this extraordinary coordination? And when you begin to think of what it would involve in terms of complexity, it's so extraordinary, and it's all happening automatically. The breath, though, we have access to it consciously. I can stop my breathing for whatever reason. I can control it when I sing. I release that conscious control and it goes back to its automatic rhythm. And when for some reason the air in the room is stale, there's not enough oxygen, automatically it adjusts by breathing more rapidly or more deeply. When I run and the oxygen balance in the blood is not correct, automatically the breathing adjusts more deep, more rapid to normal. It has to completely out of the purview of my conscious awareness. And this is only at those levels which are critical to life support. Now we come to actions which we do intentionally. I lift a glass of water to drink. Consider how much of the action is conscious and how much is unconscious. I'm having a conversation with somebody. I feel a slight sense of thirst. A part of my mind in the middle of the conversation turns, notices a glass of water, decides to drink, and then comes back to the conversation while the rest of my hand now reaches out, picks the glass which is full, assesses already what the weight of the glass will be, lifts with just enough pressure. Has it ever happened to you that you thought a glass was full and you lifted it and it went up because it was empty? Rarely happens. By the time you've sensed the weight of the glass, lifted it with just the right force needed that it doesn't spill, brought it to the mouth, and as I'm having a conversation, I'm speaking, I pause, take a sip, swallow, and it does not conflict with the air which is pumping out. It does not go into my lungs while I'm speaking. And I'm continuing the conversation, put the glass back, the swallowing movement and the digestion and everything follows automatically. If you look at it, 99% of the action was subconscious. Briefly, not even the full conscious part, a semi-conscious part chose to drink and went back, and the whole thing was done automatically. So much of our life, we are walking, all the walking, maintaining the balance, fine adjustments of the toes to keep the balance, and suddenly the ground has a bump, my toe catches, I trip, automatically the legs move to catch, keep the balance and move on. I have barely noticed that I tripped. Only when the tripping is extremely serious and I'm about to fall, something of my consciousness mind is pulled. Briefly, I'm disturbed, but I did nothing. The whole correction took place at a subconscious level. This is such a complex thing that the best of artificial intelligence for the last 40 years could not develop a conscious walking robot. Only recently there is claim that we finally got something which walks just like a human being, but if you put it in a ground which is uneven, it will still trip and cannot correct as a human being can. Where in school did you learn how to get your balance when you trip? How many times have you tripped in life that your body could learn the right way to correct the balance? Rarely, if at all. Where does that knowledge comes from? But the accuracy of the knowledge, which in this particular kind of tripping, with this particular angle, which I have never had before in my life, the leg needs to move exactly like this, in this way, with this force, to regain the balance. We don't even know where the knowledge comes, and the knowledge is so accurate, so almost infallible. It is fallible only in mirrors. As I swallow, it's automatic. But if at that point I interfere and I try to speak at the moment of swallowing, there's a little bit of water that spills and I cough. And even then the act of coughing is completely subconscious to push out the water to prevent it from entering the lungs. Everything in our life at the level of action also has this huge amount which is subconscious and a tiny part on the surface which is conscious. And we know now that it is a mind that acts and not merely an ignorant nervous reaction from the brute physical brain. So it's not like when you tripped, there was a nervous reaction that made your foot fall in the right place. There's a complexity involving knowledge and precision which involves an intelligence that is operating. And often when there are reflexes, especially with reflexes which involve survival, you touch something hot and your hand moves back. They say the signal does not even go all the way to the brain. The whole operation is taking place at the level of the arm. At best it goes to the local point of the spine. But in fact, so much more has taken place in the hand itself. Where does the intelligence come in there? To know exactly how to move the hand to protect itself. The subconscious mind, now comes the third example, the subconscious mind in the catering insect knows the anatomy of the victim it intends to immobilize and make food for its young. And it directs the sting accordingly as unerring as most skillful surgeon, provided the mere limited surface mind with its groping and faltering nervous action does not get in the way and falsify the inner knowledge or the inner will force. That is, if the surface mind does not come in the way, then this action will be infallible. What does the surface mind offer? Groping, faltering, nervous action. How to do this? I'm trying to balance and it falls, I'm not sure. It's always trying, tentative, reactive. And when it comes in the way, it falsifies the inner knowledge. What came in has now got so distorted, I don't even know what was true. Or the inner will force, the push of the is blocked and distorted. So two aspects, the knowledge which involves the perception and the will force which involves the action, both of these are spoiled when the conscious mind comes in the way. But the example here, let's look at that, and then we will look at a few more examples which support this. The subconscious mind in the catering insect. Catering, if you see the common use of the word today, it means providing food, serving food. So a caterer is somebody who serves food. And it's actually the same meaning here, but more deeply. The original sense of the word catering is with the hand reaching to grasp and take. So it is this taking movement to feed, especially relating to food. Taking to feed its young. So the catering insect. And he's saying this with a deliberate reason. He doesn't say just the insect which is stinging. It's the catering insect, because in nature, insects don't sting merely for the sake of it. Human beings do. We have a word for it, we call it game. And game means going and shooting animals just for fun. Insects don't do that. Animals don't do that. If at all they have to sting, it is in self-defense or it is because they need food. In self-defense, it is a state of reaction, terror, fear. And sometimes there is a hit, sometimes there is a miss. But in the catering instinct, it is getting food. It does not have any fear or hatred. Here is the food, I have to take it. And so it reaches out. And at that point, there is the clarity in the consciousness that the action can be perfect. In the moment of fear, it may still sting and hit sometimes the nerve, but not always, because there's a disturbance and agitation. But in the catering, it is clear, it stings and hits straight precisely at the nerve. Knows the anatomy of the victim, it tends to and make food for its young, and directs the sting accordingly. So when the snake bites, the tooth will enter exactly the softest part, avoiding the bone where it could not have gone in. And generally, it will approach a vein or an artery and insert precisely at the depth where it will enter the vein or artery, in order to immobilize and paralyze as quickly as possible, as neatly as possible. When you see the cheetah grabbing the deer, it goes straight for the neck, for the jugular, and blocking the breathing and the flow of blood to the brain, as quickly as possible to asphyxiate and make him lose consciousness and lose vitality, to fall and stop. It does not make the mistake of going lower or higher, exactly at that soft spot. How does it know? And you'll see the same pattern in all the creatures in nature. It directs the sting accordingly because it knows the anatomy of the victim. It knows what's inside and how it is and where exactly it needs to intervene. As unerringly as the most skillful surgeon, because there is a penetration inside, you must know what is there. A surgeon, for example, when they have to operate, they will first inject an anesthetic. The anesthetic cannot be injected just anywhere. It must be injected exactly on the nerve, where the nerve goes. So the surgeon has first to make out where the nerve is, find that point where the maximum number of nerves come in, and there only you inject the anesthetic. If you get it wrong, then either the numbness will not be enough, it will not spread enough, or it will not cover the full region. If you do it precisely with minimum intervention, you can make a large part numb. And that's the kind of knowledge which the animal has. These examples point us to truths which Western psychology, hampered by past ignorance posing as scientific orthodoxy, still ignores or refuses to acknowledge. So the examples point you to the truth. If you follow the example, the conclusion is inevitable. But current Western psychology is hampered by past ignorance orthodoxy. You see, you have a religious orthodoxy and you have a scientific orthodoxy. And the scientific orthodoxy is often based on past ignorance. We used to think that on that basis we made certain assumptions. Now those assumptions have become the belief. So for example, look at the sun. It's so hot when the sun comes out, therefore the sun must be so hot, isn't it? And if from that huge distance the heat reaches us, it must be so much more hot, millions of degrees perhaps, that some bit of that millions of degrees must reach us and make us hot. But if you think about it, the reality is, when you go out, you do not get, in fact, you get cold more than heat. The transmission of heat is not taking place through empty space. Empty space, being a vacuum, of course, it's not a perfect vacuum, does not transmit heat. You know, a vacuum flask where you store hot tea is a vacuum flask. The vacuum is an insulator. It does not allow heat to come out. So the heat from the sun would not reach the earth if there was a vacuum. So either you believe that there's a huge amount of transmitting medium which carries heat, which is not true, or the sun probably is not so hot. But there was an assumption made 200, 300, 400 years ago, or maybe 1,000 years ago, which has now defined the whole thinking. In fact, when we measure the sun's surface, we find, yes, the surface is quite hot, but the deeper we go, the cooler it is. And the insides are quite cool. So the heat is being generated on the surface, but the inside is cool. It doesn't make sense because of past assumptions. So many times there is a scientific orthodoxy. There's a built-up belief system. And when new evidence comes which contradicts, we try to force fit the evidence, limited belief. And when it doesn't fit, often we ignore the evidence. It's inconvenient. It does not get published, and so on. It's not good for your career to point to things which destabilize current beliefs. The result, of course, is quite unfortunate for humanity, not only for science. Now, recently, there is, just in the last 1 year, there's a lot of loud discussion about how the last 40 years, nutritionists gave wrong advice that butter is bad for you. And the reason for that was that nutritionists were not chemists. They didn't look at what is happening inside the body. They said, you eat fat, therefore body will catch fat, therefore you should not eat fat. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the absorption of the body and the storage mechanism, which is triggered not by the quantum of fat you eat, but by a certain chain associated with sugar. And now the recognition is that eating sugar is what makes the body accumulate fat. The fat itself, eating it, is good for you. Butter is good for you and reduces so many other illnesses. So now suddenly that whole advice is taking a complete reversal. But if you looked at the evidence in the 1970s, there were a series of tests and some chemists who had discovered this chain, spoken of it, and the entire medical fraternity pushed them out, refused to acknowledge the evidence, and even denied them the right to publish. And so all the evidence was set aside and forgotten until it was rediscovered 10 years ago. And it took 10 more years recently to bring it to the domain where it could be accepted publicly, and so on. So there's a whole resistance to change. If you take these three examples and think about the implications, you have forced to recognize mind is not dependent on brain. Senses are not dependent on nervous system. Mind is able to absorb, retain, and understand with extraordinary precision, with infinite capacity, and therefore is separate from brain. Brain, therefore, is the vehicle through which the mind acts. In fact, it is a vehicle which narrows and limits mind. Mind itself is unlimited. Today, for the first time, we have a few scientists who are speaking in these terms. There's actually discussion taking place. Again, it's considered the fringe, where they say the brain is not the instrument of consciousness, the brain is rather a filter of consciousness. What is consciousness? And giving us limited perception of it. That line of thinking is much more close to the yogic knowledge and the truth of things. The Upanishads declare that the mind in us is infinite. It knows not only what has been seen, but what has not been seen. Not only what has been heard, but what has not been heard. Not only what has been discriminated by the thought, but what has not been discriminated by the thought. Sri Aurobindo is using a language which is repetitive here, and for a reason. He's giving 3 examples. What we have seen, what we have heard, and what we have discriminated with thought. Not only these 3 which are taken consciously, but what has not been seen, not been heard, not been discriminated. What does that mean? What I have not seen, not only what I have not seen in front, which is before my eyes, I was busy looking at the glass of water. I did not notice that behind there was a small bottle because I was busy with this. It's not that, not just what I didn't see, but what was not in my domain of sight. Even that is being noticed by it. What is not spoken, what is not heard by the ears, even that has been heard. That far away right now there's a conversation taking place a block away, which I'm not able to hear. That consciousness which is infinite has heard it. It does not bring it to my attention because it is not right now connected to the conscious part of me and does not place the relevance of it here, does not see the relevance of it. But if in my conscious part now, I start wondering what is happening there, and I think about it, brood on it, or put that intention and then set my mind aside and ask my subconscious mind to give me that information, it will then take cognizance and bring forward that knowledge. If my mind is clear enough, I can receive. If my mind has a preconception, of course, I will distort it. And it is in this way that we learn most of what we learn actually in life. We may have the illusion that I learned. That's not true. You will notice when you read, you don't understand. You close the book, you go to sleep. Next morning you open and read, and now you understand. So you say, I read the book and I understood. No, you didn't. The first time when you read it, you did not understand. The understanding took place not when you read it a second time, it took place when you were asleep. Because at that point, the conscious mind had made an effort to try to understand. It couldn't. When it went to sleep, the subconscious mind now received this. The inner knower turned. I'm using vocabulary which Sri Aurobindo uses, by the way, in his writings on education. He says, the inner knower turns, takes cognizance of what was sought. Because that saw, because that understood, now when I pick up the book and read, I understand now. Meaning the real understanding is taking place behind the surface conscious part. And it is when that understands and engages with the surface, the surface understands. And so there is always this period of turning of the inner consciousness to align with the surface, attempt to know. And when the alignment takes place, then the surface says, now I understand. The emergence of understanding takes place. But it was understood, or the part within already understood and knew, but now there was alignment by which it could come forward and fill the surface non-understanding part. This is happening in all our learning. And I give this example often to convince people. The whole vocabulary that you have of the words that you know of any language, and sometimes multiple languages, How many words in your life did you actually look up a dictionary or ask somebody the meaning of? Barely a few. 20, 30 perhaps, at best as exercises in the school. But in real life, you never have to ask somebody the meaning of a word. It pops up in the context. Meaning is just known. And when the subconscious was much more vividly active and the conscious part was not interfering too much, we soak in language and meaning and the vocabulary and the grammar structure, and it just flows out of us spontaneously, effortlessly. And if we could somehow retain that kind of flexibility into our adulthood, we would actually have the same access today. What is coming in the way is the formed, organized, thinking, conscious personality, mind learning process. And the more I involve myself consciously in the learning process, the more I am interfering with the spontaneity of the learning. And that's why the best way to learn a language is not to study its grammar. It is to read, to listen, to watch movies, to interact with people, to live the life with people in that language. And then the whole thing gets assimilated at that subconscious level. While you are busy enjoying, while you are busy following the story, watching the drama, that part is absorbing and organizing and bringing forward the meaning. And then one day you suddenly find you're able to speak the words and quite fluently and easily. And the same for everything else. Except where it involves technical terms, of course you need to define. With grammar it is useful to finalize, to fix with precision in the surface consciousness. It's part of the surface organization and its precision to study grammar after you have learned the language. Then you study the grammar to give precision and vocabulary to words, to experiences which you otherwise have intuitively. And the same for technical learning. The concept itself is to be known intuitively. The vocabulary is built by the association. So I give examples of this in some of my teacher training programs. I lead them to a complex experiential experience of an idea in physics, and then I give the vocabulary and I say, this is how you have to teach. Words and formulas, and then try to give a concept. The concept has to be experienced and lived and brought forward from within, to which you give vocabulary. And so if we reorient all our learning in this way, you find things become so much easier. When you read Sri Aurobindo, similarly, if you try to follow what the words are saying, you will get stuck with the complexity of the sentence structure. I will say, just read through rapidly, get the hang of the word, get the experience of what he's saying, get into the mood of it. Read rapidly even when you don't understand, and feel. And when the feel is filled within you, it forms, and then you reread a second time. And then you'll find the words now make so much more sense, because the meaning has already set the framework. The words fall into the structure. And then a third time, look at the meaning of the word, not merely as it is understood today, but the root sound, the origin of the words. And then you'll see these extraordinary insights, suggestions pointing to deeper, rich ideas. And it amplifies, intensifies what you already knew, which you had already held and received. And this is the right way to learn. When Sri Aurobindo taught Greek, I think it was to Nalinida, he is an adult, it's not a child, but he knows not one word of Greek. He started with one of the classical plays. He didn't start with A, B, C, D, he didn't start with cat and bat, he didn't start with simple children's books, start straight away with a play. And of course, at first, initially you struggle. But very quickly, the mind gets into the mood of it and you pick it up in this way. So, the Upanishads declare that the mind in us is infinite. It knows not only what has been seen, but what has not been seen. Not only what has been heard, but what has not been heard. Not only what has been discriminated by the thought, but what has not been discriminated by the thought. Let us say then, in the tongue of our modern knowledge, now we are restating the image, from the Upanishadic vocabulary to the modern language. From the tongue of our modern knowledge, that the surface mind, the surface man in us is limited by his physical experiences. He knows only what his nervous life in the body brings to his embodied mind. And even of those bringings, he knows he can retain and utilize only so much as his surface mind sense attends to and consciously remembers. But there is a larger subliminal consciousness within him, which is not thus limited. That consciousness senses what has not been sensed by the surface mind and its organs, and knows what the surface mind has not learnt by its acquisitive thought. That, in the insect, knows the anatomy of its victim. That, in the mind outwardly insensible, not only feels and remembers the action of the surgeon's knife, but knows the appropriate reaction of suffering which were in the physical body inhibited by the anesthetic and therefore non-existent to the physical body. That in the illiterate servant girl heard and retained accurately the words of an unknown language and could, as yogic experience knows, by a higher action of itself, understand those superficially unintelligible sounds. Sri Aurobindo is taking us not only to an understanding of those three examples, but farther up. Not only that part remembers, but in a higher action of its consciousness, it can even understand all that. There is a part within, in that higher inner consciousness and a higher part of the inner consciousness, which can actually know the meaning of a language you do not know and which you do not understand, to which you have not paid conscious attention. And still it will catch the meaning. It is on that level that our true understanding begins, and from there drips down, reflects in the inner, and from there leaks out and reflects in the surface, and then we say, now I understand. This surface understanding is possible because there is the thing behind of which the higher function has already the understanding. And now it all makes sense. It's so simple, it's so obvious. So he's used a vocabulary of the modern language. But what would be the old language? The old language uses symbols. And one of the examples we have in the Puranic symbol, this is not Vedic, it is later, but it takes the same truth, gives it a more overt human form, more accessible to undeveloped mind. We have this term, Chitragupta. Chitra, image, registration. Gupta, secret. Secret registration. And in the Puranic vocabulary in symbol, it is given a form of a person. And children are told, everything you say, everything you do is being watched from above. And Chitragupta is sitting there and noting down everything. And one day he's going to ask you, what did you do? Now that's accessible to a child, someone sitting there. But the word is not about a person, it's image secretly registered. And the more modern vocabulary was Akashic records. That there is a domain of consciousness, very subtle, in which everything that is happening in the universe is being registered. Because it's happening against that backdrop. It's like the screen of the movie on which the image is being projected, and as the light images change, the screen is not just supporting, it's the whole story. Where does it store it? In its underlying cosmic consciousness. Everything happening is being held. Not only what's being projected, but everything which is also attempted. I tried to do this, but something came in the way and deflected my action. But the attempt created an imprint, an image, a conception at the mental level or at the energetic level, which also is being registered. So all intentions, all that attempted to happen as well as all that happened is there. That's happening. And what is attempting to happen for the future in terms of the trends of the current energies and possibilities which are there in the future is all being held there. And so when you tap into that underlying consciousness of the cosmos, you can actually see, feel, know, hear, experience all that happened in the past, all that's happening in the present, and even the future, but as a possibility, a registration of a possibility among all the possibilities. But when you experience it in that consciousness, it's not like a screen with a projection. You experience in 3 dimensions as if you are immersed in it, as if it's happening to you right now. So sitting here, if the consciousness were projected backwards and at a different location, suddenly there, and you'd see, feel, experience the things happening there, as if they're happening right now. But the state of consciousness being different, one is as if somehow disoriented, and so one is not able to register accurately. But if the consciousness is clear enough, down to the tiniest detail, everything is there, because it's held there, Chitragupta. So there is a similar concept at various stages in the vocabulary, the symbolism changes, but you use simple terms to catch deep truths. In the example Sri Aurobindo gives here, the insect has access to precise biology and the word he uses here, anatomy of the victim, has access to that knowledge of anatomy with precision, not at a conscious level. It's not like Leonardo da Vinci, who's cutting open the body, noticing and observing. The insect senses, it senses here and hits. But behind that is a consciousness which knows and has the full knowledge in 3 dimensions and the full possibility of the anatomy, how it will move, in what way it will try to avoid, and it reflects in the instinct of the insect to push and hit there. But the insect itself is not conscious of the anatomical detail. And it is in the same way that in the physical body, the suffering and the sensation, even which was non-existent in the body, is known and registered, and the servant girl can retain the language and even access meaning. And so here now we use the vocabulary of the Vedanta. To return to the Vedantic words we have been using, there is a vaster action of the Sanjnana which is not limited by the action of the physical sense organs. And he says later, there is also associated with it a corresponding vaster action of Prajnana, Ajnana and Vijnana, not limited by the smaller apprehensive and comprehensive faculties of the external mind. And what are those operations? How does that part see? We will see next time. But you see how he has brought us back to that discussion which we had the last few times with this vocabulary of these 4 words. And now how it operates in that layer of consciousness which has full access, as distinct from the surface layer which has limited access and limited awareness. And from there we will move to the 5 senses. So it's a fascinating piece, very deep in its implications for us, not only in understanding but even in our practice and for life. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.